Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me. My name is Dr. Frida Polli, and I'm here to talk to you today about how we can think about unbiasing our recruiting and workforce decision systems. I'm currently the CEO and founder of Pymetrics. Pymetrics uses artificial intelligence and behavioral science to make workforce decisions more accurate and more fair. Prior to that, I was an academic scientist at Harvard and MIT for about a decade. So a lot of the learnings that I'm going to be sharing with you today really stem from my academic training. So without any further ado, I'd like to jump into the presentation because I have a lot of exciting things that we're going to be talking about today. So the gist of this presentation is how we can use AI to reduce bias in workforce decisions, but it's also more broadly about how we have to start thinking about changing systems and not human minds. And I think that that's the most critical takeaway from this presentation is we have to stop thinking that we're going to fix diversity by changing people or their brains. We have to start thinking about how we're going to fix diversity by changing our systems. Great. So again, very high level, I think, we all are kind of aware that hiring is suboptimal, if not broken. It's inefficient. It has a high failure rate. The candidate experience is not fantastic. But what we're really here to focus on today is why is there a continued lack of workforce diversity? The reason for that, I would posit, is that we have been for too long focused on how we can change the human mind or the brain rather than thinking how we can change systems. So I'd like to just give you a little bit of an introduction into the human mind, how it works, the different thinking systems that underpin it, and then we can move on to why that's relevant for recruiting and workforce decisions. So Daniel Kahneman has this great book called Thinking Fast and Slow, where he outlines these two thinking systems. And again, many people have spoken about these two systems, but he sort of wrote a big book on it. And he called one system the fast thinking system, and it's this immediate instinctive system that really makes most of its decisions based on pattern recognition. And then we have system two, which is our slow thinking system, which is reflective, methodical, nuanced. And I think when we think of ourselves as human beings, we really focus on our system two thinking to sort of to characterize ourselves. And that's great. It's wonderful. Our slow thinking system really does reflect the best of humanity. However, I think we like to ignore the fast thinking system, which often gets us into a lot of trouble. And we can't do that. I think we have to be very cognizant that both systems are in play. Now, just to put it in perspective, the reason we have a fast thinking system and a slow thinking system is because evolutionarily both were adaptive. So if you in the jungle saw a tiger, you didn't want to have a 30-minute debate within yourself as to what to do. You wanted your brain to say tiger, danger, run immediately, and then head off in the other direction. And there's still modern day examples of where this is very, very useful. So the fast thinking system has its place, as does the slow thinking system. However, the fast thinking system can really get us into trouble when it comes to diversity and bias. So, and again, just to reiterate that the fast thinking system is really part of our more instinctive brain. As I just mentioned, and again, it's still evolutionarily adaptive to this day. It doesn't mean that there are many places where we don't want to exert 30 minutes of effort to make a decision. Some might be picking out a brand of toilet paper at the store, following the same route to work every day. But as you can tell by the third bullet, making a quick judgment of a book based on its cover has sort of dual meaning. If you're really just making a quick judgment of a real book by its cover, that might not be so problematic. However, as you know, we use that analogy to say that you're sort of judging someone based on a stereotype, then that actually can be a problem, as we'll get into. So how is this a problem in hiring? So it's very straightforward path. Fast thinking underpins unconscious bias. Now we've had a lot of decades worth of sort of writing on unconscious bias. We have tests that can discern unconscious bias, and so on and so forth. I think we know that unconscious bias in hiring exists. I don't think we have to be convinced of that any longer. That is entirely a system one thinking process. The reason that it's a system one thinking process is because, generally speaking, the amount of time that a recruiter takes to read a resume, unfortunately, because they're inundated by resumes, is about 6 seconds. You cannot engage in a slow thinking process if you only have 6 seconds. That's not possible. And so I think that this is when unconscious bias comes in. And the way to think about unconscious bias is it's really a system that's reliant on stereotypes. So you may have stereotypes about women. You may have stereotypes about people of different ethnic backgrounds than yours. You may have stereotypes about different socioeconomic backgrounds. You may have stereotypes about, people that went to certain schools, people that work at certain companies. I mean, I think we can all, recognize that stereotypes play a big part in our lives. And again, I'm not here to judge that because we all do it, including me. But in hiring, it can become particularly problematic. And the reason it can become particularly problematic is because it makes us prioritize certain things and focus on certain things that can then lead to outcomes that we're not particularly happy about. And the most obvious example of this is when people do what are called audit studies of resume reviews. So an audit study is where where a research organization submits the same resume to a company, but it changes the name. So it will submit the exact same resume, but instead of, John Williams, it will be Jamal Washington or something like that. And the implication is they test, gender and race by changing the name. If you wanted to look at gender, obviously it'd be Jane Williams. And it's both alarming and disheartening to see the results of these studies. So in 2017, there was a meta-analysis that was published of 24 audit studies, callback studies. And what they found was that for every 10 interviews that were given to John Williams, the resume that had the white sounding name, identical resumes that had just the name changed to a black sounding name got 7 interviews, and the same resumes that got the name changed to a Latino sounding name, Latinx sounding name, got 8. So essentially, discrimination continues to happen. It is entirely driven by unconscious bias. This is not a process that we are intending to engage in, but we cannot walk away from the fact that it continues to exist. And by the way, we all do it. I do it, you do it. It's not these people do it and I don't. It's everybody does this, unfortunately. And so we have to realize that this fast thinking system is really, really undermining our efforts to create a more diverse workforce. And by the way, this study was conducted during a time that the slow thinking system 2, was saying, I want more diversity. I want to not have discrimination be part of the process. So it's not that these two systems are often in opposition to one another. And we see this outside of hiring. You could see this in other contexts. But so while our slow thinking system is engaged with diversity, wants to have more diverse results, the fast thinking system is undermining that. So we really have to move away from this idea that unconscious bias, that we have to really grasp the fact that unconscious bias is hugely problematic. So now that hopefully I've convinced you that it's a huge problem, the second thing I want to convince you about is that unconscious bias training doesn't work. There has been a lot of study of this as well. There's a 10-year meta-analysis of 30 studies of unconscious bias training that was recently published. And again, they found that unconscious bias training was completely ineffective in actually changing unconscious bias, and with good reason. Unconscious bias takes decades to develop. You are not going to, in a 4-hour training or even a 4-day training, remove something that has taken decades to develop. And in fact, it can be harmful at times because it gives an organization a false sense of confidence that they are combating prejudice when that's not the case. So I'm not saying don't do unconscious bias training. You certainly can. It's a good sort of educational experience for people, but do not come away from that thinking I have now fixed unconscious bias in my workforce, in the brains of my the people at work at my company. Just realize that it's an educational tool, but you still are going to have those people walking around with unconscious bias, because I currently am walking around with that, as are all of you. So that might sound like a kind of dystopic, conclusion. Well, we all have unconscious bias, and oh, by the way, the training that we've really hoped would help doesn't help. It might sound a little discouraging, but it's really not. And I think that what it really leads us to needing to understand is that we have to change systems and not people's minds to make hiring more equitable. And when we change systems, what we're doing is we're allowing our system 2 thinking to really be fleshed out. We are saying our system two thinking will develop these wonderful systems that can sort of exhibit the best of system two thinking, the best of our slow, deliberate thinking. And that's what we can use to make hiring more equitable, is systems change, not changing individual minds or people. So how can we do that? There are multiple ways that we can change systems. I'm a technologist, so I'm going to speak about the fourth in greater detail. However, there was a great report that was put out recently called Evidence-Based Ideas to Increase Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Workforce. A workplace that's hosted by the UMass Center for Equity. And I highly recommend that you go and check it out. It talks about a variety of different tools that we have to changing systems. And I'm just going to give you a brief overview of each of them before I sort of dive into technology. So one is metrics and goals have been found to be really helpful. The second is transparency. The third is accountability. And the fourth is technology. So I'm going to just dive in really quickly to 1, 2, and 3. These are less my areas of expertise. And again, I highlight that report that can be found on the UMass website. The first is metrics and goals. When firms reveal what outcomes they value through the data they analyze, they can really help with workforce diversity. And so the gist of this is that organizations should treat diversity just like any other goal that you have at your company. If you're trying to increase revenue, you have certain metrics and goals to get there. And it should be the same with diversity. It's not any different. So it's really just, it's back to that, you can't manage what you measure. You cannot manage what you don't measure. And I think it's the same thing here. We have to be very conscious about the metrics and goals that we're putting forth. The second is transparency. Again, very straightforward stuff, right? So if you have metrics and goals, that's wonderful, but then they need to be visible. And so basically those metrics and goals need to be transparent to both internal and external stakeholders. That's why people publishing their diversity stats, even if it makes them somewhat, embarrassed about the current situation, is a good step forward, because it allows us to then have a discussion about the current situation and really help us move forward. And the third is accountability, right? So again, no one is going to change unless they are held accountable. And that's true for many different things. So organizations really need to create accountability structures in order to have these metrics and goals and transparency then be acted upon, right? Because if we have metrics and goals, we have transparency, that's wonderful. But if no one knows whose job it is to actually change to achieve these goals, again, just like any other business process, you would have vast confusion and you probably wouldn't get anywhere. So again, these are very straightforward tools. It's almost like we really shouldn't need to say this, but again, I think when it comes to issues of diversity, these things feel very sensitive and more challenging. So I just want to put out there that academic research has shown that all three of these things can be extremely helpful in achieving diversity goals. So the fourth is technology, and that's obviously where I spend most of my time and what I know the most about. So I do want to spend a little bit of time in discussing the types of technology that we can leverage in making hiring more equitable. Now, I am sure that most people listening to this presentation have heard that technology can be biased. And I'm here to say, yes, that is true, absolutely true. And we're going to sort of go through the ways in which we can know or try to discern whether a technology is going to be helpful when it comes to mitigating bias or not. And I know it might sound confusing, because I'm telling you, hey, technology can be really helpful, but then you've read all these, newspaper articles saying, my goodness, you got to be aware of this AI, it might have bias in it. So what are we to do with the situation? So what I would say to you is this, that an algorithm, AI, technology, it could be either a friend or a foe. And it's really just about the design intent of that technology, because ultimately at the end of the day, algorithms learn from real world data, and bias in those algorithms or bias in that technology really means that the world is biased, right? And I always like to say that the AI didn't, the AIs didn't go off to a convention and decide to be biased on their own. AI is just really holding a mirror up to us and saying, hey, people, this is the society you've created. And unfortunately, we don't often like what we see. And so it's sometimes easier to blame the technology or the AI and say, oh my goodness, I don't like this reflection, let's turn off the AI. But unfortunately, that bias that exists in the real world doesn't go away. We stop reflecting it back. So I would actually argue that continuing to invest in technology and making it unbiased is the way to go, not to shun technology. Because again, that bias, whether I just told you that human brains are unmitigatably biased. And so if we don't look at technology as a solution, I'm not sure what solutions we have left. So again, how is the real world biased? I mean, this shouldn't surprise anyone. Resume data is biased, meaning that you can have almost identical resumes submitted by a male and or female. This is from an actual study, but because the female went to a women's college, and even though baseball and softball are almost the same sport, she played softball, not baseball. An AI system can actually learn to be biased against this resume, even though it's essentially identical to Charlie's resume, but it has what are called proxy variables for being a woman, meaning a female college and a female sport. So that's one way that data can be biased. The second way, obviously facial recognition, facial analysis has gotten a lot of press recently for being inherently biased, or not inherently biased, but having a lot of problems with recognizing certain populations accurately. And again, there are certain vendors that are using facial analysis in hiring. We think that's not a great idea for a variety of reasons, including the fact that these systems continue to produce biased data. So those are two examples of bias in the data, both a resume and a facial analysis system. And the end result is that if you just learn off of that data, you will create biased AI. And we've had, lots of, sort of disconcerting and alarming headlines around this. However, I think what I'd like to focus on is that unlike the human brain, which I just told you cannot be unbiased, an AI system can be audited and is explainable, and then can be designed to be bias mitigated. And so that is, I think, the most hopeful thing here, is that it is really about the design. So algorithms, learn from the decisions that we've made in the past, but we can essentially audit those decisions, and we can make them, and we can essentially go in and alter the decisions that we don't like, unlike the human brain, where I just told you that unconscious bias is not something we can alter. And therefore, as a result, we can really use these algorithms to be debiased. And so I'd like to just show you some examples of that, if I may. And before I go there, I think the two key elements to an unbiased AI system are, one, using unbiased data. And anyone who's interested can go to Pymetrics and we can sort of tell you more about that. But essentially, it's using data that is not biased. And soft skill data, which is what Pymetrics uses, is far less likely to be biased than hard skill data that's on a resume and so forth. And the second thing is you have to audit your technology. And if your vendor of algorithms does not produce any sort of audit trail of their technology, this audit should be done before you deploy a technology and then after you've deployed a technology. And ideally, they will have had a third-party audit, because otherwise you're just sort of trusting what they say to be true. And that's not ideal. So it's critical that audits be conducted. So again, it's unbiased data and auditing of the technology that can make a person feel secure that the technology that they are deploying is bias mitigated. Great. So I'd like to give you some examples that we feel confident pass these thresholds as examples of debiased technology, and also encourage you to check them out on your own. So these are 4 companies that we are familiar with that produce debiased technology and that have shown to be quite effective in reducing bias in hiring decisions. So the first is Textio. You've probably heard of Textio. The challenge that Textio is trying to fix is that a lot of times when people are creating job descriptions, the actual language that they use can sort of encourage certain groups of people to apply and discourage others from applying. Again, all of this unwittingly. So for example, if you're trying to hire a software engineer and you say, I'm looking for an aggressive code ninja, which is a real job description that Textio has found, you are likely to attract a more male candidate pool than a female candidate pool, because those words don't appeal or don't feel very gender neutral. And so that is the challenge that Textio took upon itself, and that is what their solution does. A lot more than this, but this is sort of the one that they're best known for, which is basically making language more inclusive so that you can attract the best and most diverse talent. And they've seen great outcomes in terms of number of women applying to jobs and number of underrepresented groups applying to jobs. So we'd highly recommend you checking out Textio to look at your job description and other language that you're using in your recruiting processes. The second company that we're familiar with is HiredScore. HiredScore also produces audits of their technology and has done a really good job of making sure that they provide statistical analysis of fair treatment among similarly qualified applicants. And they can also do a lot of other things with the HiredScore brain, but essentially their whole technology takes resume data, which can be highly problematic, as I just said, and really focuses on how we can ensure that even with using resume data, you are making, you are mitigating the bias in your outcomes as much as possible. So again, they've also seen increases in diversity, both from a gender and ethnic perspective when their solution has been applied, and highly recommend that you check out HiredScore. Applied is the third company that we feel very comfortable saying also meets the criteria for being an unbiased technology. They work a little differently. Their sort of a basic premise is that they blind recruiters to a person's gender and ethnicity and so on. That is another technique that, if we had more time, we could get into. But definitely anonymizing applications can also go a long way. It doesn't fix everything because, again, going back to that resume example that I gave you, even if you had removed Charlie and Charlotte, if you had known that one went to Barnard, you would know that they were a woman because in the US, that's a women's college. Or if you'd known that they played softball, again, in the US, women play softball and men play baseball, even though it's basically the same sport, you would still know that that person was a woman. So it does have its limitations. However, it is a really good start. And it's basically called fairness by blindness through blindness. And again, Applied has shown some really excellent results. And it's not all that they do. They also do they chunk applications, meaning that you have two candidates applying, and instead of looking at candidate one and all of their answers, and then candidate two and all of their answers, which can lead to, again, a person developing a stereotype about one candidate and not another, what they do is they have you evaluate the questions in chunks. So you would look at question one for all of your candidates first and rate them that way, and then question two. And in using that process, you can actually reduce bias significantly as well. So they do a variety of different things, all geared around behavioral insights and how to reduce bias. And again, you can see that they've really done a great job of increasing female and underrepresented populations in the workforce. And then again, the last technology that I'm obviously the most familiar with is Pymetrics. And so I just want to spend a teeny bit of time sort of highlighting, Pymetrics and sort of the impact that it's had on fairness in the workforce. So again, in the United States, fairness in hiring is legally defined as the 80% rule. It's called statistical parity. Basically means that if you're using a particular tool to select candidates, if you're going to select 10 candidates of one group, you should select no fewer than 8 candidates of another group. And that's true. Doesn't matter what demographic group we're speaking about. That's the standard. And again, this is proportional to application rates. So if you have 100 men applying and only 10 women, it's fine to select 100 men and 8 women. It's proportional to the pipeline. The ratio has to be 0.8. And what I'd like to highlight here is, that I think we are sometimes unaware of the impact that traditional tools and processes might have on how they compare to this 80% rule. So unfortunately, traditional cognitive testing, which is used extensively, at least in the United States, about 60% of companies hiring today use it, has really dramatic, significant impacts on racial inclusion. So generally speaking, when you use a cognitive test on the broad population, it is 3 times more likely to recommend or to pass through a Caucasian candidate, and is 2 times more likely to pass through 3 times more likely to pass through a white candidate than a black candidate, and 2 times more likely to pass through a white candidate than a Latinx candidate. And again, this is not because of inherent differences in intelligence. It is largely due to socioeconomic factors that link to success on these tests. So we would say that I think a lot of people still using cognitive testing are unaware of how dramatically problematic they can be for racial inclusion. And as we start to really focus on racial inclusion, if you're using a cognitive test and yet want to improve diversity, it's a little bit like eating a cookie and brushing your teeth at the same time. You're basically working at cross purposes. So we would highly recommend that if you're using a cognitive test, typical cognitive test would be a vendor like an SHL, but there are lots of others that you look into the impact that it's having on race, because generally speaking, it's not great. Human resume review, we already looked at this. We know that essentially for every 10 white candidates that are being passed through, only 7 African-American or Black candidates are making through. And for Latinx candidates, it's 8. And again, this is obviously not intentional. It's due to unconscious bias. But the whole point here is that, one of the most commonly used pre-application screens, a cognitive test, fails the 80% rule pretty dramatically. And then human resume review also fails the 80% rule. So really what I'm trying to put forth here is that the 2 most commonly used forms of evaluating candidates fail when it comes to the legal definition of parity. When you begin to use an audited AI system, such as the one that Pymetrics has developed, you get basically very close to statistical parity, meaning that what we see with Pymetrics is very close to about 10 African-American and 10 Latinx candidates being selected for every 10 white applicants. And again, this is by design. We have designed our system to do this. This wasn't an accident. And so what we can say is that an audited system like Pymetrics is 30% better at screening in qualified Black candidates than human resume review, and 200% better than cognitive testing. So again, if you really are seriously considering trying to improve racial equity and diversity, we would strongly recommend that you look at one of these 4 systems that we've talked about, and certainly discontinue using some of the other methods that we've outlined in this presentation. And again, just results, some of the results we've seen have been pretty significant in terms of increasing female engineering hires, increasing, minority candidates as well. And the thing that we haven't really talked about in terms of diversity is socioeconomic diversity. It's sort of an under discussed type of diversity, but it's also really critical when we think about socioeconomic mobility and improving socioeconomic inequality. And again, because our system doesn't look at, race, gender, or socioeconomic background in terms of any kind of resume data, it can also be really powerful in terms of mitigating socioeconomic bias. So again, I just want to leave you with this idea that part of the reason that we can do this is because we measure soft skills rather than hard skills. And we really believe that whatever technology you're using in your hiring process, soft skills are critical for accurate and fair talent matching. The reason is, first of all, they're measuring something that is far more durable than what's on a resume. I think Deloitte said that, the typical hard skill has a shelf life of 3 to 5 years. Your soft skills are far more durable. So they give somebody a much better sense of who they are and what they can be focused on. Secondly, they're very future facing. So a resume or a hard skill is all about your past, what you have done in the past. It tells you nothing about what you can do in the future. And I think today, in this day and age, we really need to be focused on the future, what someone can do, their potential, rather than what they've already done. Third, again, we've already mentioned this, pathways to economic opportunity. Soft skills are not unequally distributed when it comes to socioeconomic status, which is not true for hard skills. And also with respect to gender and race, the same is true. So they're more equitable, they're more future facing, and they're more durable. So whatever tools you're using within your company, we would highly recommend adding a soft skill layer, not to mention that it puts the human back in human resources. But if that isn't convincing enough in and of itself, I think that they are far more likely to produce a fair outcome. And then this is just to say that obviously, we as a platform are committed to fairness. These are some of the things that we do. We use unbiased data. We debias our algorithms. We've led the way in producing a third-party audit of our system, and we are developing standards that we hope other companies will follow in the future. So we really feel that we have a strong commitment to equity, and that's it. So would like to just leave you with the fact that current outcomes in hiring are a function of the systems we use. And I think we should see it as a reflection of the fact that our systems are not working, rather than human beings are somehow, horrible people that just can't get it right. It's really that we have been focusing on the wrong thing. We've been focusing on trying to change human minds, and hopefully I've left you with this nothing else, the idea that that's not possible, and we really need to start thinking of changing our processes and our systems rather than the human mind. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to thank you very much for your time today. And if you have any more questions, it's frida.polli@pymetrics.com, or you can just email info@pymetrics.com, or you can go to our website. A lot of the information I presented here today is available. And I thank you for listening, and I look forward to the next time we meet. Thank you very much.